History of agrarian reform. It is a 100-year history of unfinished reforms after the colonizers invaded the country. Before the Hispanic period, there were no owner-cultivators, only communal lands. Agrarian reform in the Philippines seeks to solve the centuries-old problem of landlessness in rural areas. Probably, the farmers qualified beneficiaries, tillers or farmworkers who are landless or who own less than 3 hectares of agricultural lands. Because of the agrarian problem, the farmer is poorer. They cannot afford to pay more taxes and thus, the government cannot raise sufficient revenue with which to support its operations. In an agrarian society, cultivating the land is the primary source of wealth. Such a society may acknowledge other means of livelihood and work habits but stresses the importance of agriculture and farming. They have been the most common form of socio-economic organization for most of recorded human history. Agrarian reform on the different eras of the Philippines. Pre-colonial times, Spanish era, and American era. Pre-colonial times before 16th century. Land was commonly owned by the community known as barangay. This is a small unit of government consisting of 30 to 100 families administered by the chiefs. Everyone in the barangay regardless of status had access to the land and mutually shared resources and the fruits of their labor. They believed and practiced the concept of stewardship, where relationship between man and nature is important. Land cultivation was done commonly by kaingin system or the slash and burn method, wherein land was cleared by burning the bushes before planting the crops, or either land was plowed and harrowed before planting. Maragta's code seems to be the only recorded transaction of land sale during this time. This tells us about the selling of the Panay Island by the natives to the 10 Bornean datus in exchange of a golden salakot and a long gold necklace. Spanish era, 1521 to 1896. The colonial government at this period introduced a pueblo agriculture, a system wherein native rural communities were organized into pueblo and each Christianized native family is given a 4 to 5 hectares of land to cultivate. The pueblo agriculture practiced no sharecropper class or landless class. The native families were merely landholders and not landowners. By law, the land assigned to them was the property of the Spanish king, where they pay their colonial tributes to the Spanish authorities in the form of agricultural products they produced. The Spanish crown made a law in 1865 ordering landholders to register their landholdings. Only those who were aware of these decrees benefited. Ancestral lands were claimed and registered in other people's names, Spanish officials or local chieftains. As a result, many peasant families were driven out from the lands they have been cultivating for centuries or were forced to become tillers. As more tillers were abused, exploited, and deprived of their rights, the revolution of peasants and farmers in 1896 articulated their aspirations for agrarian reform and for a just society. Women also fought for freedom and played an important role in planning and implementing the activities of the revolutionary movements. The revolutionary government confiscated the large landed estates, especially the friar lands, and declared these as properties of the government. Malalos Constitution, 1896, Article 17. American era, 1898 to 1935. Realizing that being landless was the main cause of social unrest and revolt at that time, the Americans sought to put an end to the miserable conditions of the tenant tillers and small farmers by passing several land policies to widen the base of small landholdings and distribute land ownership among the greater number of Filipino tenants and farmers. Philippine Bill of 1902. This law provided regulations on the disposal of public lands, wherein a private individual can own 16 hectares of land while the corporate landholdings can avail of 1,024 hectares. This also gave the rights to the Americans to own agricultural lands. Here are government's initiatives on agrarian reform. Manuel L. Quezon, 1935 to 1944. President Quezon laid down a social justice program focused on the purchase of large haciendas which were divided and sold to tenants. This administration was responsible for establishing the National Rice and Corn Corporation (NARICC) and assigning public defenders to assist peasants in court battles for their rights to the land. Budget allocation for the settlement program made it impossible for the program to succeed. Widespread peasant uprising against abusive landlords continued. In addition, the outbreak of World War II put a stop to the landownership and tenancy interventions during this period. Manuel Rojas, 1946 to 1948 Republic Act No. 34 was enacted to establish a 70-30 sharing arrangement between tenant and landlord. 70% of the harvest will go to the person who shouldered the expenses for planting, harvesting, and for the work animals. President Rojas negotiated for the purchase of 8,000 hectares of lands in Batangas owned by the Ayala Zobel family. These were sold to landless farmers. However, due to a lack of support facilities, these farmers were forced to resell their lands to the landowning class. This failure gave basis to doubt the real meaning of the land reform program. Elpidio Quirino, 1948–1953. Through Executive Order No. 355, the Land Settlement Development Corporation (LASEDECO) was established to accelerate and expand the peasant resettlement program of the government. However, due to limited post-war resources, the program was not successful. Ramon Magsaysay, 1953–1957. President Magsaysay realized the importance of pursuing a more honest-to-goodness land reform program. He convinced the elite-controlled Congress to pass several legislation to improve the land reform situation. Out of the targeted 300 haciendas for distribution, only 41 were distributed after its 7 years of implementation. This was due to lack of funds and inadequate support services provided for these programs. Landlords continued to be uncooperative and critical to the program, and landownership and tenancy problems continued. Carlos P. Garcia, 1957–1961. There was no legislation passed in his term, but he continued to implement the land reform programs of President Magsaysay. Diosdado Macapagal, 1961–1965. President Diosdado Macapagal has considered the father of agrarian reform. It was during his term that the Agricultural Land Reform Code, or RA No. 3844, was enacted on August 8, 1963. This was considered to be the most comprehensive piece of agrarian reform legislation ever enacted in the country that time. Ferdinand E. Marcos, 1965–1986. Presidential Decree No. 27 became the heart of the Marcos reform. It provided for tenanted lands devoted to rice and corn to pass ownership to the tenants and lowered the ceilings for landholdings to 7 hectares. The law stipulated that share tenants who worked from a landholding of over 7 hectares could purchase the land they tilled, while share tenants on land less than 7 hectares would become leaseholders. Corazon C. Aquino, 1986–1992. Various sectors recognized agrarian reform as a worthwhile social investment. In terms of the tenant-tiller status, this improved particularly those within landowners' retained areas or on landholdings subject for coverage. 40. It's during this administration that the present adjudication system was introduced. This gave DAR the original and exclusive jurisdiction over agrarian disputes as quasi-judicial powers. Also, livelihood and agro-industrial projects promoted, and a program of support services was intensified to help farmer beneficiaries become productive and transform them into entrepreneurs. Fidel V. Ramos, 1992–1998. The Ramos administration is recognized for bringing back the support of key stakeholders of CARP by bridging certain policy gaps on land acquisition and distribution, land valuation, and case resolution. It is also credited for enhancing internal operating systems and strengthening the capabilities of the DAR bureaucracy. This administration is also credited for tapping more resources to help implement the program. Failure in enforcing the installation of some farmer beneficiaries on awarded lands became an issue for this administration. Critics say that non-physical installation of FBs has been the norm rather than the exception. Josep Ejercito Estrada, 1998–2001. This administration saw the urgency of land distribution and believed that it can be served if it is built on farmers' capacities to pursue their own development. One of the first things this administration did was to rework performance targets by focusing on the number of hectares of land distributed coupled with an accounting of farmer beneficiaries and the specific croplands and farm systems covered. President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, 2001–2010. The GMA administration has adopted the Bayan-Anihan concept as the implementing framework for CARP. Bayan means people, Anihan means harvest, and Bayanihan means working together. Applied to CARP, Bayan_Anihan means a united people working together for the successful implementation of agrarian reform. 52. This administration is also credited with heightening agrarian case resolution by introducing a quota system to compel adjudicators to work faster on agrarian cases and train farmers into paralegals. Benigno C. Aquino, 2010–2016. Under the governance of President Aquino, the DAR, which is the lead agency for CARP implementation, is bent on sustaining the gains of agrarian reform through its 3 major components: land tenure improvement, program beneficiaries development, and agrarian justice delivery. 54. Together with the efforts to fight graft and corruption by the President, it is imperative to have institutional reforms within DAR as a complement to the above-mentioned DAR components, as well as give credence, transparency, and accountability at all sectors of the DAR bureaucracy. President Rodrigo R. Duterte, 2017 up to present, renewed his administration's commitment today to pursue the full implementation of Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program (CARP) as he graced the 31st anniversary celebration of the government's land distribution program. Speaking during the event at the Department of Agrarian Reform in Quezon City, he noted that it is only by empowering farmers that the country would achieve the sustained growth of its rural economies and eventually the nation's inclusive progress. As President Duterte acknowledged the gains of the DAR in the implementation of CARP in the past 3 decades, he nonetheless stressed the need to finally accomplish the ultimate goal of the program through the administration's agrarian reform.